A little bit about the early years, Patti.
The early years were really spent in Washington, D.C., Bogota, Colombia, Mexico City, then back to Washington, D.C. Let's see, that would have been until I was 5 or 6 years old.
So you had initial experiences that influenced you.
They're probably back in there somewhere. When I took Spanish, I think it came forward a little bit more quickly than it otherwise might have. So we moved out here to Omaha in 6th grade, where I started in Dundee School.
What was Omaha like in those days?
It was a kid's dream, really. We lived at 50th and Chicago, and I walked a block to school. All of my siblings, followed after me in the neighborhood, went to the neighborhood church. It was like you would put in a television show, really.
And then on to Benson High School?
On to Benson High School. We moved from 50th and Chicago to 50th and Cumming about a week before school started. And lo and behold, that meant I went from Central to Benson.
We've had a number of distinguished alumni who came out of Benson High School in that era. What was it about Benson?
Coincidence, I think. I think Paul Critchlow is probably one of the people that you're referring to. I will say that I'm still close to a lot of the people I went to Benson with, and that is a considerable number of years ago. So whatever it was bonding.
And then you made your way to our campus?
I did. It was funny. That was a generation when parents encouraged you to pick a career that would be stable and secure. And I tried to do that to begin with. But everything I'd ever done in high school that was fun involved journalism. So that's essentially the motivation. That's why I picked journalism for college also.
And you wrote for the Gateway and the yearbook?
And the yearbook, and that was so much fun. I remember one of the big exposés that I did for the Gateway, and it involved having a diagram drawn of the student lounge, which at that point was called the Wampy Room. And I detailed where all the fraternities sat and where everyone sat in the room. That was considered a big exposé for the day.
And you were also active in student government.
I was on the student council and an officer in my sorority, and really enjoyed being on campus and kind of right in the thick of things. It was high on the bootstrapper era, where men who had been in the military came and finished their education here. So it was a very unorthodox college atmosphere. Men who we thought were very old at the time, who must have been in their late 20s or early 30s, combined with basically teenagers in their first college experience.
That must have made some of your classes rich in the sense of the experiences that they brought to the classroom.
Well, I think so. I think so. Most of the bootstrappers were not in journalism per se, but they certainly were everywhere you looked on campus, and we enjoyed the experience of having them there.
So you graduated and with honors and went out into the working world.
I did. I started out at the Omaha National Bank here in Omaha, then went to the phone company, where I was lucky enough to work for two really great editors who had a lot of patience in terms of teaching their new hires really how to write. Not what we thought was writing, but writing for the world around us. And I was there for, I think, 2 or 3 years.
And you said you talked your way into John Y. McCollister's campaign.
I raised my hand and volunteered for his campaign. He'd been an elder in our church, and I admired him, and ended up following him around with a camera and doing newsletters overnight on a light box that we had at the company, and really enjoyed that. And then when he unexpectedly got elected, I came to see if he would consider taking me to Washington as his press secretary.
What was it about that election that made it so competitive?
John McCollister challenged a very long-time Republican incumbent who was considered entrenched in office. His name was Glenn Cunningham. and people in the party were shocked, and they were even more shocked when he won. And then I didn't realize this really until last night, but he ran against a man named John Lavacek, who'd been a television commentator and had a lot of airtime interviewing the boys from Vietnam. And he had defeated Bob Riley, which I didn't realize until last night. But at any rate, that was a very close race, and if I'm not mistaken, Omaha was Democratic at the time, but John unexpectedly prevailed with 51% of the vote. So.
And you became his press secretary?
And I became his press secretary in Washington.
What was that job like for?
It was a real learning experience. I really did not have a clue what I was doing and didn't have very long to figure it out. But a lot of fun, because at heart I was an Omaha girl, and every day constituents came in town, and you really kept in touch with people back in Nebraska. And at the same time you were learning what it was like to work with the media and use your creativity to try to get more visibility for your boss so that the next election would be a little bit easier for him.
And Washington offered your next opportunity.
Well, it did. One of the wonderful things about a congressional experience is that you really learn about constituencies and how constituencies congeal, if you will, and have influence in terms of how things go in Washington. And it's really no different after that. That the basic grounding in constituencies and what they mean served me well in the White House and then subsequently in television, because I always knew when we would have an adverse reaction to a program that was picked, because I had that Midwestern sense of what had caused unhappiness or comment in Washington from that basic congressional office experience.
At the White House, this was a historic period in terms of the country, the Watergate scandal, the rather abrupt resignation of President Nixon. What do you recall from those years as your takeaways?
You know, I must have been 24, 25 years old, so it was a big learning curve. Working with the national media in a fairly pressured situation, working probably 12 to 15 hours a day. I worked very closely with Julie Eisenhower, who was the only one in the administration who was really out there giving speeches. So I worked in the press office during the day and worked on her speeches at night, and she would go off and give that speech, and then 2 or 3 days later we would start the same cycle again. So that was also a big learning curve. Made a lot of contacts in terms of the national media. Saw how press was covered, how I would have viewed a story and all the different ways that it actually came out in the papers at the time, and that was a real learning experience.
And then you had the opportunity to work with Betty Ford.
I did. After President Nixon resigned and President Ford came in, there was pretty much a wholesale change in the administration, because nearly everybody left the White House. But another woman and I were asked to stay and help Betty Ford. She had not obviously had national office exposure before, and I stayed as her assistant press secretary.
And you traveled quite a bit in this.
A lot. One entire year was combing the country during the primaries, and I think I took my big red Samsonite out in January, did not come back until September, and I think I went to every single state except for Georgia and Massachusetts, the only ones that were unlikely to go Republican. So,
I remember that Ford-Carter election as being a very interesting election. What did you experience during that out on the campaign trail?
Well, you would go from one location to the next and barely get your arrangements made when the the National Press Corps would land, and you'd do that trip and on to something else. The visual picture I really remember was at the end when President Ford, when he came to concede, lost his voice. I don't know if you remember this, and Mrs. Ford needed to read his speech to the live television cameras. It's probably still on YouTube. It was really quite a moment.
I think of the book, The Boys on the Bus. Was that an accurate portrayal of journalism in that era?
Absolutely. It was wild and woolly.
So 1977 brought you an opportunity to work in television.
It did.
And I think also not only work in television, but with quite an innovator in Roone Arledge.
I was recruited when he took over the news division. He had been known as a sports impresario, and there was a lot of media attention on whether he could make it in news. And ABC knew there would be a lot more attention in news, and they were looking for somebody that had the congressional and the White House experience, and somebody put us in touch. And that was a very happy experience. They had not had anybody in a press secretary role in Washington before, so it was wonderful to get involved in broadcasting and be able to use the contacts that I'd been building all those years.
I think of the traditional news skepticism about a Roone Arledge heading ABC News, or a Ted Turner launching a cable news channel. And my thought is, great people do great work. Is that the kind of experience you had with Roone Arledge?
You know, television is essentially storytelling, and Roone was a master storyteller. He had applied those skills first to sports, but he was a Columbia Journalism School graduate, and he was an ethical and imaginative man. So what he did was bring those storytelling skills to news, and he was quite successful. He also had quite a sense for talent and which personalities brought a story to life on the air. And he did very well in finding them and recruiting them. It was pretty hard to say no to Roone.
And this allowed you to make the move from Washington to New York.
Well, what happened was I was recruited for the Washington job, and shortly after that, I would say 6 months into that job, a job opened up in New York that was speaking to the business press about ABC as a business, about which I knew absolutely nothing. But once you're in a company like that, and I guess they trust you, they think that they'll expose you to the material and you'll figure it out. And that's what happened in my case. So I left the news area and went to the corporate area.
And this was on the eve of some significant mergers about to happen in television news, and ABC was the first, correct?
ABC was the first, and at the time it was the largest non-oil merger in U.S. history. A small company that none of us had ever heard of, called Capital Cities ABC. Capital Cities at the time was a group of small station owners who were doing quite fine out of the public eye. Very profitable, very well run, and Leonard Goldenson, who was head of ABC, sold ABC to this group of people who ran a company called Capital Cities.
So you're working at ABC, and I'm guessing the employees at ABC were wondering what the future was going to be like under Capital City.
It was the first of the 3 networks to be sold. So yes, it was a jarring time for everyone. And the Cap Cities people were known as cost cutters. And they did it in a very interesting way. They called all of us who were department heads in and explained that they were looking at the balance sheets and something was going to happen to have to change the business to a more workable model. And they would depend on us to go back and look at our areas and come back to them and tell them how we could run our operations more efficiently. So we were put in charge, each of us, to see how many people we could cut and how we would reorganize. So instead of a very corporate way of getting approval for jobs and what each person did, we figured it out ourselves, which was really new in a corporate environment. So it was, you know, we were sorry to lose the people, but the way they did it was the best way that it could have been, putting everybody in charge of their own future.
Omaha's Warren Buffett was on the board during this period. Did you have the
Yes.
opportunity to interact with him in that setting?
The thing that was so interesting is nobody knew who Warren Buffett was. I, of course, knew because I had worked at the grocery store across the street from his grocery store. And I had known from working for Congressman McCollister that people in Omaha knew who he was, but he never came out. So even the congressman at that point had not met Warren Buffett. So I had a bit of a leg up being from Omaha and knowing something about Warren when the media didn't even know who he was at that time.
We have our thoughts here in Omaha about Warren Buffett, but living in New York, having known about him for many years, talk about what he means to the financial community and to media.
I'm not sure I can be objective. I think most people in the financial world look at him as an icon. I see the personal qualities that he has, his sense of humor, his mastery of history, his analogies. When you're talking to him and he is able to pull in this bit of history and this bit of history and come up with one of the most creative or funny analogies you can think of, he is very creative. It's not just the financial piece. He is very creative in terms of his sense of humor. He is such a talented writer. It's just a very unusual group of qualities that he has.
Is there anything anywhere that is like the Berkshire Hathaway shareholders meeting?
Oh, I was just saying to somebody yesterday that there are certain experiences in life that everybody should give themselves. And one of them is going to a Berkshire meeting. I mean, when will you ever see two men like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger up on the stage again? And if there's anyone in Omaha who hasn't gone, they need to get there.
The head of ABC at this time is someone who Warren Buffett has talked about.
Mm-hmm. He is my hero, Tom Murphy. He not only, he and his partner Dan Burke not only made ABC and Capital Cities a profitable, well-run, respected company. They were really beacons for ethical leadership. And they did it by example. They weren't out pounding their chests and saying it's important to be ethical. But you knew from management meetings, from every way they conducted themselves, that that was the most important thing. That you did not, if you lost money, that was acceptable, but you couldn't lose a shred of your reputation. That was Warren Buffett, it was Tom Murphy, and I was fortunate enough to work in that environment.
That is something that Mr. Buffett reminds students about when he meets with them.
Oh, I'm happy to hear that.
That there's nothing more important than your reputation.
That's exactly right.
And your company's reputation. So as someone who managed reputation for ABC, did you find yourself in circumstances where you really had to remind people that ethics came first?
No, because it was something that ran through the company from the top on down. We had a management meeting every single year in which that was top of mind and in the most subtle ways, and it started with their management creed that was on the inside of their annual report, that it was a decentralized company and nothing was more important than your reputation.
Media kept changing and along came Disney.
Yes, 10 years later. I had 10 years at ABC, and then the second 10 years were at Capital Cities ABC, and then Tom Murphy took a look around and understood that we were one of the few companies that were still independent and thought about how the company could compete in the long run when everything else was a behemoth. And he, and actually Warren at one of the Herbert Allen conferences, got together with McCollister, and that's when the Disney merger grew out of that conversation.
Disney influenced ABC moving forward?
ABC went from being a very decentralized company under capital cities to a centralized company. And it also became California-centric as opposed to New York-centric. It influenced my life personally because my husband lives in London and we commute back and forth, and Burbank, California just didn't work in my life plan. But eventually the senior management from ABC who had been in New York did move out to Burbank, and Bob Iger, who'd been head of ABC on the East Coast and was raised in the image of Tom Murphy and Dan Burke, now heads the Disney company on the West Coast, and that was a part of that merger process.
I want to touch on the idea of growing up in this world we've been talking about and being a woman executive for a large corporation. I mean, you broke some ceilings on the way up, and what was that experience for you and going forward, I think, for other women in terms of the changes in the culture?
It was a gradual change. When I think back to when I got into the company, there were not very many of us. And it was important to speak out, but it was important to speak out in a very palatable way because there were a lot of prickly personalities at that point. After the Cap Cities ABC merger, and I went to work for Tom Murphy, he was very supportive, and that support tends to radiate throughout a company and makes things a little easier. So I think I was the only woman in the senior management meetings. So that kind of signal that's sent to the company makes things easier for you around the company as well.
And you continue to consult for ABC?
I do. I consult for the Walt Disney Company. I still have a small office at ABC, and I go in when my successor comes in from Burbank. And it's nice to keep my hand in the business. I enjoy it.
You also are on the Susan T. Buffett Foundation?
I am very happy to say that that is the fact.
What is the work of that group?
The group is very involved in women's health, and we support organizations around the country and primarily overseas as well.
What are the other key issues that you're interested in at this point?
I'm on the board of AMFAR, which is the American Foundation for AIDS Research. That's something that interests me. And then other than that, I try not to get oversubscribed. I'm traditionally a list person. I have a list that I can never quite get through of things that need doing. And I'm trying to learn to live more in the day as opposed to in my lists. Do you think I'm going to have any luck doing that?
I doubt it. I can't imagine that. You now have the opportunity to see UNO as it is now compared to
my
when
gosh,
you were here.
what a change. What a change. We were a handful of buildings then. I mean, less than a handful. And just to show you the contrast, I got lost getting to this studio today. That's a good thing.
And how about Omaha? It's grown as well in
Well,
the years.
I've been able to keep up with Omaha because of my meetings on the Buffett Foundation. And I must say, I love it more every time I come. I look down from the plane and I see all the green and how the forefathers of the city have improved that entrance into the city from the airport. And it all starts from there. It just gives me such a great feeling to come back.
You've mentioned that Midwesterners might have a bit of an edge because of how we are perceived.
Do you know, people trust Midwesterners. And when you're in an environment like New York, they're not really, we're taught to not talk about ourselves and to always ask the other person about themselves. And in some environments, that can be very much a contrast. So somehow, I know a lot of Midwesterners who have made it quite nicely in New York, and I think the qualities that are stressed here in a Midwestern upbringing work very well wherever they translate into whatever part of the country.
You also have some advice for current students going out into the work world. What do you think is the most important for them to keep in mind?
Do you know, students from the communications area, I think, have a very special obligation and responsibility. They are the keeper of the flame of good English, what I say. That there is too much competition not to know where a comma goes. And I think that whatever medium we go to, even if it's texting down to Twitter, I appreciate the fact that we can get things faster, but you cannot get away from the impact that basic words and good English have on our society. And people in our business and communications really are the keepers of that flame.
Patti Matson, it's been a pleasure having a conversation with you about your life and career, and a distinct honor to be able to recognize you with the UNO School of Communication Lifetime Achievement Award. Thank you for being with us today.
You're very kind, Jeremy. Great to talk to you.
Thank you. I'm Jeremy Lipschultz, School of Communication. Have a great day.